In the dark and freezing December of 1940, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread, tan that frayed with every passing hour. The Battle of Britain had been won at the skies, but the Blitz raged relentlessly in the streets below. London was burning its historic neighborhoods, reduced to smoldering rubble as the Luftwaffe pounded the industrial. For the British people huddled in air raid shelters, clinging to hope amid the chaos, the Empire still seemed invincible. Task splash of pink covering a quarter of the globe on every classroom map, a symbol of strength that had endured for centuries. But inside the war rooms of Whitehall, the men who ran the British government knew a terrifying secret, one they dared not whisper to the public. The British Empire was not just bleeding soldiers on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. It was bleeding to death financially. What followed was a master class in ruthless policies and unforgiving negotiations during World War II, designed to strip Britain of its wealth, its assets, and its gilding power, ultimately driving the world and greatest empire into bankruptcy. And here's the chilling truth that should haunt every American and European today. The British Empire-wide final fatal mistake is the exact same mistake the United States is making right now. And by 2026, those mistakes may finally catch up with it, bringing an end to American dominance. To understand how the wealthiest empire in human history reached the point of destitution in 1940, we must first revisit the ruthless economics of total war-torn conflict unpiled. It owned a massive portfolio of overseas investments. British citizens controlled railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, tea plantations in India, and vast industry concern of. But Hitler in war was not a traditional conflict of armies and territory. It was a war of machines, a war that consumed steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at a rate that defied all pre-war calculations. And crucially, Britain had to import almost everything it needed to fight. The Nazi blockade of the European continent cut Britain off from its neighbors, leaving it with only one lifeline: the Atlantic Ocean and the United States beyond it. At this stage in the war, the United States was officially neutral. The American public was deeply isolationist, still haunted by the memories of World War I, when hundreds of thousands of American boys had died in the muddy trenches of Europe, fighting a war that many believed was not America. Never again, they vowed. A sentiment that echoed through Congress, which had passed a series of neutrality acts designed to keep America out of another foreign slaughter. These acts contained a specific clause, known as Ben-and-Cash and Karen, a rule that would prove to be the first nail in Britain's financial coffin. The cash and carry law stated that belligerent nations like Britain could buy American supplies, guns, tanks, planes, food, but they had to pay for them in cash immediately, no exceptions, and they had to transport them on their own ships, leaving them vulnerable to German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic. There would be no loans, no credit, no grace periods. The Americans were happy to sell the weapons of war, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before a single crate left the dock in New York or Boston. For the first year of the war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these brutal demands. It liquidated its gold reserves in a top-secret operation known as Operation Fish, ship one of the most audacious movements of physical wealth in history. The British government loaded the entire gold wealth of the nation onto battleships and fast liners, risking everything to ship it across the dangerous Atlantic to vaults in Canada, where it could be safely converted into US dollars to pay the American bill collectors. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities were sent into exile. But by late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington, which was responsible for buying planes and tanks from American manufacturers, had conjuring officials in London told them there were no dollars left to honor them. Britain was on the brink of collapse, and Winston Churchill knew it. Churchill, the man whose voice was rallying the free world with speeches that would go down in history. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, sat at his desk in the underground cabinet war rooms in London, surrounded by maps and telegrams, to write one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Churchill was a master of the English language, a man who could turn a phrase in the face of overwhelming despair. But in this letter he had to perform a delicate and humiliating dance. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the workshop of the world, the empire that had defeated Napoleon, the nation that had ruled the seas for over 100 years, was completely and utterly broke. The letter was long and detailed, filled with descriptions of the strategic situation, the U-boat peril in the Atlantic that was sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them, the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft to defend against the Luftwaffe. The wrestling was in the tail. Churchill wrote that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies it needed to survive. He wrote that the British people would fight on the beaches, in the landing grounds, and in the fields, and in the streets, but they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival, a desperate cry for help, and an admission of insolvency that must have tortured Churchill in pride. He was asking the United States to save Britain, not out of friendship, not out of solidarity, but because if Britain fell, Hitler would turn his sights on America. When Roosevelt received Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes. He knew that if Britain collapsed, the United States would be left alone to face Hitler and growing empire, with no allies in Europe to stand between America and the Nazi war machine. But he also faced a political problem. Mex, a huge one. He could not simply give money to Britain. The American laws forbade it, and the American public would be outraged. He needed a way to help Britain that looked like a hard-headed business deal, not a charity handout. He needed to sell the war effort to the American campaign, to convince them that helping Britain was in America's best interest. This is where the concept of Lend-Lease was born. A policy that would be hailed in public as an act of generosity and solidarity, but in private would prove to be a ruthless tool to dismantle the British Empire. Roosevelt explained Lend-Lease to the press. He said that if your neighbor house is on fire, you don't haggle with him over the price of a garden hose. You lend him the hose and he gives it back when the fire's out. It sounded simple, it sounded generous, it sounded like a neighborly act of assistance, but the reality of the negotiations that took place behind closed doors in Washington, D.C. was entirely different. It was not a conversation between neighbors, it was a foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. The United States held all the cards, and it was not afraid to use them. The man in charge of the American Treasury at the time was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., a staunch anti-fascist who wanted to help Britain defeat Hitler. But he was also the guardian of the American taxpayer. He believed that before the United States gave a single dime of aid, Britain must prove that it had stripped itself of every last asset it possessed. He wanted to make sure that the British weren't hiding any money, any investments, any wealth that could be used to pay for their own war effort. Morgenthau demanded the full audit of the British Empire. Every asset owned by the British government, every asset owned by private British citizens, anywhere in the world. He wanted to know the value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, every share of stock, every factory, every railroad, every mine. Nothing was off. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned. They were being asked to open their books to a foreign power, to lay bare the entire financial infrastructure of the British Empire. They were being treated not as an ally fighting a common enemy, but as a failed company in receivership, one that needed to prove it was worthy of a bailout. Phillips tried to argue, to reason with Morgenthau. He explained that Britain had already sold off its gold reserves, that there was no more cash to give. He explained that selling off long-term investments in the middle of a war would be a fire sale, that they would get pennies on the dollar for assets that were worth billions in peacetime. He argued that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war, unable to feed its population or rebuild its cities, unable to maintain even a fraction of its former power. But Morgenthau was unmoved. His instructions from the president were clear. The logic was brutal but unflinching. If Britain still had assets in the United States, why should the American taxpayer subsidize the war? Why should a farmer in Iowa pay for a tank for the British Army if a British lord still owned a factory in New Jersey? Why should an American worker in Detroit fund British ammunition if a British company still controlled a profitable Indriish? Morgenthau wanted to make sure that every last penny of British wealth was used to fight the war before the American people were asked to contribute a single dollar. And in that pursuit, he targeted one of Britain's most valuable overseas assets, the American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was a massive and artificial silk in the United States. It was owned by a British company, Courtaulds, and it was a jewel in the crown of British overseas investment. It was highly profitable, generating millions of dollars a year in dividends that flowed back to London. For Britain, American Viscose was more than just a company. NE was a lifeline, a steady source of income that would help them rebuild after the war. But for Morgenthau, it was a target. He told the British negotiators that they had to sell it no ifs, ands, or buts. He wanted the cash from the sale to be deposited directly in the U.S. Treasury to pay for the existing orders of weapons and supplies that Britain had already placed but could no longer afford. The British resisted fiercely. They knew the company was worth over $100 million, perhaps even more. To sell it in a rush during a war, when everyone knew they had no choice, would be financial suicide. But Morgenthau held all the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was making its way through Congress, and the inkling that Britain was actually rich and was trying to trick America into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb, a tangible expleading that it was truly bankrupt. He gave the British an ultimatum: sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease will die in committee. For Britain, there was no choice. On a Sunday in March 1941, under immense pressure from Washington, the British government seized the American Viscose Corporation from its owners, Courtaulds, using emergency war powers. They did not ask permission. They issued a compulsory purchase order, effectively nationalizing a British-owned company to sell it to the highest bidder. The sale was handled by a group of American investment Packety Merstel. The bankers drove a merciless bargain. The company was sold for roughly $54 million, a seemed fraction of its true value. It was theft, plain and simple. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds back in London, adding to their own internal debt, while the dollars from the sale went straight into the U.S. Treasury to pay for rifles, tanks, and aircraft engines. The sale of American Viscose was a turning point. A moment when the British elite realized the true price of the Bayan specialty they'd cheapened. They were not partners. They were a junior entity being stripped of their assets to pay for their own survival. The United States was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. But it wasn't just industrial assets that the United States demanded. The liquidation extended to the guild foundations of the empire itself. While the financial negotiators were arguing over stock prices and factory sales, another deal was being cut team that would forever alter the balance of power in the Atlantic. Britain was desperate for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships that lifeline to North America. The source of food, oil, and weapons was being cut. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, ships that had been built during World War I, that were sitting in mothballs in American naval yards, rusting away obsolete, and of little value to the modern U.S. Navy. For Britain, these ships were a matter of life and death. Roosevelt agreed to give them to Britain, but again there was a price. He did not give them for free. He traded them in exchange for 50 rusting, obsolete ships. The United States demanded 99-year leases on a string of British naval and air bases across the Aleutian, Bermuda, to the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Think about the scale of that trade. Britain gave the United States a strategic footprint that covered the entire Western Hemisphere. They handed over the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, allowing the United States to build military bases, all for 50 old ships that were barely seaworthy. Ships that would soon be scrapped after the war. It was a GLA fire sale. Britain was trading its long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival. The act of a desperate nation hawking the family silver to buy food by the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941. Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. The U.S. investments were being sold off at fire sale prices. The bases were leased. The British treasury was empty. Lend-Lease was hailed in public as the Bina Arsenal of Democracy, a noble act of solidarity that would keep Britain alive and help defeat Hitler. But the financial terms of the arrangement laid the groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be a debtor and America would be the creditor. The aid was not a gift, it was a lease, and the underlying assumption was that there would be a reckoning, that there would be a price to pay after the war. Hidden deep in the text of the Lend-Lease Agreement was a clause known as Article 7, that small paragraph written in dense diplomatic language, but one that contained a poison pill for the British Empire. It stated that in return for the aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. It was a system of tariffs that favored trade between Britain and its colonies, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth nations. It meant that British goods were cheaper in empire markets than American competitors. It was the mechanism that allowed British Nevada to survive against more efficient American competition, that allowed Britain to maintain its economic damage. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own economic defenses to open up its empire to American exporters. The British negotiators fought against Article 7 tooth and nail. They knew it meant the end of the empire as an economic unit, the end of Britain's ability to control its own economic destiny, but they had no choice. The German bombers were still overhead, pounding London and other cities. The U-boats were still in the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships. The cash was gone, and Lend-Lease was the only thing keeping them alive. They signed the agreement, knowing that they were sealing the fate of the British Empire. As 1941 turned into 1942, and the United States officially entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the dynamic shifted, but not in Britain's favor. Now Britain and America were fighting side by side. American soldiers poured into Britain, and the island became an immense aircraft carrier for the U.S. Army Air Force. But the financial disparity between the two nations only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending and the absence of enemy bombing, exploded in size and efficiency. The U.S. economy grew by huge percentages every year during the war, as factories churned out planes, tanks, ships, and consumer goods. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being distorted and cannibalized by the war effort. It abandoned its markets in Latin America and Asia, markets that had been crucial to its economic survival. And who stepped into those markets? American companies, while British factories were making Spitfires, tanks, refrigerators, radios, and cars, 5 of which were sold to the global market. The United States was fighting a war, but it was also stealing Britain's commercial future. One factory, one market, one customer at a time by 1944, the transfer of wealth from Britain to the United States was absolute. The financial center of gravity had shifted across the Atlantic, from the City of London to Wall Street, but the final humiliation for Britain was yet to come. The British people believed that their sacrifice would be honored, that because they had bankrupted themselves to save Western civilization, the Americans would treat them with generosity after the war. They believed that Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period, that there would be a soft landing, that the United States would help them rebuild their economy and their empire. They were wrong. They had forgotten the lesson of the American discos sale, forgotten that in the world of high finance, gratitude is not a currency. The moment the war ended, the bill would come due, and the shock of that moment would break the back of what little remained of British power. The story of Britain post-war collapse is the story of how a nation can win a war militarily, but lose it economically. Britain had defeated Germany, had played a crucial role in destroying the Nazi Empire, but in doing so, it had defeated itself. It had spent its past to secure its present, and in the process it had sold its future to its ally. On the 15th of August, 1945, the news flashed around the world. Japan had surrendered and World War II was over. In London, the crowds gathered outmoan of bonfires in the streets, hugging strangers in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The tyranny of the Axis powers had been crushed. The British Empire had stood alone against the darkness and prevailed, but across the Atlantic Ocean, in Washington, D.C., there was no sentimentality, only a cold, bureaucratic machine that had been waiting for this exact moment to switch gears 7 days after the victory paper that would devastate the British economy more effectively than any German diversification. He signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease. Immediately, without warning, without a transition period. The cutoff was brutal and absolute. The order stated that, as of that moment, all aid to Britain stopped. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, American Liberty ships, loaded with wheat, were ordered to turn around and sail back to the United States. The lifeline that had kept Britain alive for years was severed in an instant. The British government was paralyzed by shock. They had assumed that the aid would continue to help them rebuild, that their economy, which had been completely distorted to fight a common war, would be given time to adjust to peace. They were wrong. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and advisor to the British government, looked at the numbers and saw the abyss. Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials, and it was paying for them with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt. Not in a year, not in a month, but instantly, Keynes calculated that Britain faced to find more. The country would have to default on its payments, stop importing food, and cut rations to starvation levels. Factories would have no raw materials to work with. There was only one option. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington, D.C. He was sick, exhausted, and suffering from a heart condition that would soon kill him. He was the greatest economic mind of the century, a man who had revolutionized economics, a man who had helped Britain survive the Great Depression. But he was going to America not as an intellectual equal, not as a representative of a great empire, but as a supplicant begging for money to keep his country alive. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He planned to walk into the U.S. Treasury and argue that Britain had fought the war for 2 years alone while America remained neutral. He would argue that Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to save Western civilization, that the United States owed Britain a debt of gratitude. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a gift. $6 billion grant, not a loan, but a retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had spent holding the line against Hitler. He called it justice. But when he arrived in Washington, he found that justice was not a currency. The mood in America had changed. The war was over, and the American public was tired of paying for Europe. The politicians in Congress were suspicious of the new Labour government in Britain, which had just been elected on a platform of socialism and nationalizing industries. They didn't want to use American capitalist tax dollars to fund a British socialist experiment where hard-faced men, uninterested in Keynes' moral arguments, unmoved by Britain's sacrifice. They told him bluntly. There would be no gift, no grant. There would only be a loan, and it would be a loan on commercial terms, with interest, repayment schedules, and harsh conditions. Keynes was devastated. He argued, he pleaded, he warned them that if they crushed Britain financially, they would destroy a vital ally against the rising threat of the Soviet Union. But the Americans held all the cards. They knew Britain had no other place to go. No other country had the money to help them. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion, barely enough to keep Britain afloat, and it came with strings attached, strings that were designed to strangle the last remnants of the British Empire. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving a loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. This meant that anyone in the world who held British pounds, no questions asked. The Americans framed this as a step toward free trade, as a way to open up global markets. But in reality, it was a way to break in for decades. The econ epoch that had stained break-in. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to accept payments in pounds, but had forbidden them from exchanging those pounds for dollars. This forced countries like India, Australia, and Egypt to buy British goods because their money was only good in Britain. The Americans wanted to smash that loop. Pitot knew this condition was a death trap. He knew that if the pound became convertible, everyone holding pounds would immediately sell them to buy dollars. Because everyone wanted American fridges were better, American cars were better, American fridges were better, American machines were better, American cobra, the pound would collapse, and Britain would lose what little foreign currency reserves it had left. But the alternative was starvation. With social collapse, reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan. They described it as a biddish part, badish ponent, b. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died just a few months later, his heart finally giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. But the tragedy was just beginning. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in living memory for Britain. Blizzards buried the country in snow, coal stockpiles froze solid, power stations shut down, factories closed, and people shivered in unheated homes, lighting candles because there was no electricity. It was in this frozen dark atmosphere that the reality of victory came home to the British people. They had won the war, but their standard of living was plummeting. Bread, which had never been rationed even during the darkest days of the U-boat blockade, was rationed in peacetime. Meat rations were cut, clothing was scarce, and unemployment soared. On the 15th of July, 1947, per the terms of the loan, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. A financial massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it to get their hands on precious US dollars. The money from the American loan, which was supposed to last for years, began to evaporate. In just 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign currency reserves. The hemorrhage was so violent that the government watched in horror as their reserves vanished, as the pound collapsed in value. They were bleeding to death financially. After just 5 weeks, on the 20th of August 1947, the British government was forced to suspend sterling convertibility. They slammed the window shut, admitting total failure. They had burned through a huge portion of the loan for nothing, had humiliated themselves in front of the world, and had proven once and for all that Britain was no longer a financial power. The British Empire had tried to play by American rules, and had been crushed. This financial weakness had immediate lethal consequences. This was the moment the baton of world power was officially dropped by London and picked up by Washington. In February 1947, the British government sent a secret telegram to the US State Department, now a message of resignation. For a century, Britain had been the guardian of Greece and Turkey, keeping the Russians out of the Mediterranean, maintaining stability in the region, but now, with the treasury empty, Britain could no longer afford to pay the soldiers or subsidize the Greek government. The telegram essentially said, "We are broke. We are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it." This telegram triggered the Truman Doctrine, in which the United States stepped in to fill the vacuum left by Britain's withdrawal. It was the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower capable of shaping global events, that it was a regional power, struggling to keep the lights on, struggling to feed its own people. The economic misery dragged on for years. In 1949, with the economy still stagnant and foreign currency reserves low, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, the pound had been worth $4.86. In 1949, it was slashed to $2.8. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living rose, and the dream of rebuilding the British Empire vanished. Britain was no longer a global power. Kiev was a debtor nation, struggling to pay its bills, struggling to come to terms with its diminished status. But the final bill for the war wasn't just paid in the 1940s. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 Tay money, borrowed to keep Britain from starving after the victory, was not a gift. It was a commercial debt with interest, a debt that Britain would spend the next 6 decades. The gloom of the 1970s, the Thatcher years of the 1980s, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. The final payment was made on the 29th of December, 2006 years after the guns fell silent, 60 years after the victory parades, 60 years after Britain had sacrificed it for prison. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Its cities in ruins, its economy in shambles, its people traumatized, but Britain won the war and was bankrupted. Its empire dismantled, its economy distorted. Its people condemned to decades of austerity. The U.S. economy doubled in size during the war, its industry untouched by bombs, its infrastructure intact. It held 2/3 of the world gold reserves by the end of the war, and through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it successfully dismantled the trading preferences of the British Empire, opening up global markets for American goods. Of the British Empire, on through the mechanisms, the United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies, with tanks, with planes. It bought it. It acquired the assets, the bases, the geo-influence, and the global dominance in a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury for the benefit of the American people at the expense of the British. The legacy of 1941 remained a scar on Britain's national psyche, a lingering sense of decline, a feeling that the best days were in the past. It fueled the BN special relationship between Britain and the United States, P9, polite euphemism for dependency. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his country from Hitler. He traded the British Empire for survival. A deal that had to be made, a deal with no other alternative, but a deal that cost Britain its future. Britain emerged from the war a moral giant, admired around the world for its courage and resilience, but an economic pygmy, unable to compete with the United States, unable to maintain its empire, unable to control its own destiny. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe. Noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest in history, but in the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation. The British Empire didn't fall. It was sold off piece by piece, asset by asset, to pay the bill for doing the right thing. But here's the part that should terrify every American, every European, every person who values the current world order. Britain's collapse was not an accident. It was the result of a series of deliberate choices that the United States is making right now, in 2024, 2025, and beyond. And by 2026, those choices may finally catch up with America, bringing an end to its global dominance just as surely as they ended Britain. To understand why, we must first look at the final mistake that sealed Britain's fate and how America is repeating it, step by step, day by day. Britain's final mistake was not the sale of American Viscose, not the lease of the naval bases, not the signing of Article 7. Those were symptoms of a deeper problem. They kept spending money they did not have to maintain a military presence. They could no longer afford. They kept pretending that the pound was still the world's dominant currency. Even as its value eroded, they kept clinging to imperial prandom. They kept telling themselves that reputation would substitute for reality, that history entitled them to a future, that the world owed them something because of who they used to be. That refusal to accept reality, that arrogance, that denial, was the final mistake that sealed their fate. Let me show you how America is making that exact same mistake right now. First, consider the debt. Britain's debt to GDP ratio after World War II was over 200%, a staggering figure that left it unable to borrow money, unable to America can debt to GDP ratio right now is approaching 120% and climbing rapidly. We added over $2 trillion to our national debt just to keep the government running, borrowing money from China, from Japan, from Saudi Arabia, from any country willing to lend it to us. We are spending more money than we earn, year after year, decade after decade, with no plan to balance the budget, no plan to reduce the debt, no plan to stop borrowing. Britain did the same thing, and it bankrupted them. America is doing it now, and the clock is ticking. Second, consider military overreach. Britain maintained military bases across the globe, spending billions to police an empire it could no longer afford. It kept soldiers deployed in far-flung corners of the world, even as its treasury emptied, even as its people went hungry. America currently spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined. Over $800 billion a year. We have over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries, from Germany to Japan, from Saudi Arabia to South Korea. We are policing the world with a credit card spending money. The worst sensible. Britain did the same thing, and it bankrupted them. America is doing it now, and the cost is mounting. Third, consider the reserve currency. Britain pound was the world's dominant reserve currency for over a century, allowing it to print money to fund its military, to borrow at low interest rates, to run trade deficits year after year. But as Britain's economy weakened, as its debt mounted, as its empire crumbled, the pound lost its status, and with it, Britain's ability to control its own destiny. America's dollar is currently the world's dominant reserve currency, giving us the same privileges Britain once had. We can print money to fund our government, we can borrow at low interest rates, we can run trade deficits, but that system is cracking. China and Russia now conduct most of their trade in their own currencies, not the dollar. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, could actively building alternative payment systems designed to bypass the dollar, even to euro more and more, in international more. The petrodollar system, which has forced the world to use the dollar to buy oil, is weakening as oil-producing nations like Saudi Arabia begin to accept other currencies. Britain thought the pound would reign forever. Both are wrong. Fourth, consider the refusal to accept decline. Britain refused to accept that it was no longer a superpower, that it could no longer dominate the world, that it needed to adjust its spending and its ambitions to match its diminished status. British leaders kept acting like they still ruled the world, even as the numbers told a different story. America is doing the same thing. We still act as if it is 1995, as if we produce everything the world needs, as if there is no alternative to the dollar, as if our military can solve every problem. We refuse to accept that other nations are rising, China, India, Brazil, and that our dominance is fading. We refuse to accept that the rules of economics apply to us, that we cannot borrow forever, that we cannot spend forever, that we cannot maintain a global empire on a credit card. That arrogance, that denial, that refusal to accept reality was Britain's final mistake. It is America's final mistake to twin and then in America. Now is the time one. Britain's fall happened gradually. Then suddenly for decades the warning signs were there. The debt accumulation, the industrial decline, the overextended military. The weak as the pound remained strong because the empire still looked impressive on a map, because British leaders convinced themselves that the good times would last forever. They ignored the warnings. Then came one crisis, just one crisis. And in 11 days, a century of dominance was over. That crisis was the Suez Crisis of 1956, and it was the final nail in Britain's coffin. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway that Britain controlled, a lifeline for its access to Middle Eastern oil. Britain saw this as a challenge to its authority, a threat to its interests, and an insult to its imperial pride. Together with France and Israel, Britain launched a military invasion to retake the canal. The military operation was actually succeeding. British forces were advancing. Egyptian resistance was crumbling. But Britain had forgotten something crucial. And America was furious. President Dwight Eisenhower saw the invasion as old-fashioned colonialism, exactly the kind of behavior that was pushing a newly independent nation. He decided to teach Britain a lesson it would never forget. The United States threatened to dump its holdings of British pounds on the open market, a move that would have caused the pound to collapse, making Britain unable to survive. America also blocked Britain's emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, cutting off its last source of foreign currency. Britain's foreign currency reserves were draining at over $100 million. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice. He ordered a kunmate and a complete withdrawal from Egypt. In exchange, America allowed Britain to receive its IMF loan. The empire had been brought to heel by its own creditor. The Suez Crisis lasted just 11 days. But those 11 days revealed what had been true for decades. Britain was not a superpower anymore. Britain was a debtor nation that had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money the moment its creditors decided to call in the debt. America's Suez moment is coming. It could be a failed military intervention in the Middle East or Asia that turns the world against us, where Congress plays chicken one too many times. And the world decides that American Treasury bonds are no longer a safe bet. It could be a gale humiliation, because they no longer need our banking system, because the dollar is no longer the only game in town. It could be something we cannot even predict, a natural disaster, a pandemic, an economic crash that reveals what has been true for years. America is living beyond its means to keep accepting our currency, our debt, and our leadership. The numbers for 2026 are particularly alarming. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion annually by 2026. More on interest than we spending more on interest. We will be like a household that is so deep in credit card debt that the minimum payments alone consume most of the paycheck. We will have no money left to invest in our economy. No money left to fund education or infrastructure. No money left to maintain our military tived as our creditors demand more and more. When Britain reached this point, the end came fast. There was no gradual decline, no gentle transition. One day, Britain was making demands. The next day, it was taking orders. One day, the pound was a symbol of global power. The next day, it was a cautionary tale. Every fallen empire believed it was too big to fail. The Roman Empire believed it. The Spanish Empire believed it. The French Empire believed it. And the British Empire believed it. America believes it now. We believe that because we won the Cold War, because we built the internet, because we put man on the moon, because we are Ben. The rules of economics do not apply to us. We believe that the world will keep accepting our currency, our debt, and our leadership forever. But history tells us otherwise. History tells us that no empire lasts forever, that no reserve currency remains dominant forever, that no nation can live beyond its means forever. The British pound did not collapse because of enemies. It collapsed because of choices. Choices to gain part in the earned. Choices to maintain pride instead of preparing for the future. Choices to live in the past instead of preparing for the future. America is making those same choices right now. Every single day we are spending more than we earn. We are borrowing instead of building. We are clinging to pride instead of facing reality. We are living in the past instead of preparing for the future. I am not telling you this to make you feel hopeless. I am telling you this because history is the best teacher we have, but only if we are willing to learn. Britain ignored every warning sign until it was too late. We still have a chance to do something different, to change course, to reduce our debt, to rebuild our economy, to scale back our military overreach, to accept that our dominance is fading, and prepare for a new role in the world. But that window is closing. The clock is ticking. By 2026, it may be too late. There is one more parallel I need to share with you, that is perhaps the most chilling of all. Before Suez, before the humiliation, there was a moment when Britain could have changed course in the early 1950s. A few economists and Treasury officials saw what was coming. They wrote internal memos warning that Britain's financial position was unsustainable, that the empire was bankrupt, that continuing to spend on military bases and imperial ambitions would destroy the country. They begged political leaders to cut military spending, to stop pretending, to accept the new reality of a post-imperial world. The public did not want to accept decline. The newspapers called the pessimists traitors and defeatists. Everyone wanted to believe that Britain was still great, still powerful, still special. So the spending continued, the borrowing continued, the denial continued, until November 1956, when reality could no longer be ignored. The Congressional Budget Office has been screaming about unsustainable debt for years. Economists across the political spectrum agree that our current trajectories, Federal Reserve chairs, and even Wall Street executives for publicly warning that something has to change. And just like in Britain, those warnings are being ignored. Politicians keep promising tax cuts and new spending programs. The public keeps expecting services without paying for them. Anyone who points out the math is dismissed as a pessimist or an alarmist. We even have our own version of Britain obsession with the gold standard. Britain destroyed its economy trying to maintain an exchange rate that no longer reflected reality. We consume more than we produce. We spend more than we earn. We borrow from the future to pay for the present, and we tell ourselves this can go on forever because we are American. Let me be clear about what happens when a reserve currency falls, when an empire collapses. It is not an abstract economic concept. It is devastation for ordinary people. When the pound collapsed, British citizens watched their savings lose value. The cost of imports skyrocketed. Inflation ate away at wages. Jobs disappeared as industries that depended on cheap foreign inputs could no longer compete. The standard of living that British people had taken for granted evaporated with feel it. Everything we import, tea is almost everything we consume, will cost dramatically more. Interest rates on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards will spike. The government will have to either slash services or raise taxes, or both. The comfortable American middle-class lifestyle will become a memory. This is not fear-mongering. This is history. This is exactly what happened to Britain. This is exactly what happens when a debtor nation loses the trust of its creditors. The British Empire trained final mistake was believing it was too big to fail. America is making that same mistake, following footsteps that lead off a cliff, and most people are too comfortable to notice. The only question left is whether we will wake up in time. Whether 2026 will be our 1956, whether 2026 will be our 1950, our own refusal to accept reality. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and right now, the rhyme between Britain, then, and America, now, is almost perfect. Same debt patterns, same military overreach, same arrogance, same blindness, same refusal to see what is right in front of our faces. The clock is ticking. 2026 is just around the core reach.